Today we will be continue on with our bar graph tutorials. So last week we already learned how to calculate our average, create our bar graph, put all of our numbers into our analysis table in order to make this bar graph, and then adding all of our titles and labels onto it. This week, we're going to take it one step further and add our statistics. So just like with scatter plots, we have our squared values to help tell us the strength or how closely our data points follow that line. For bar graphs, we use standard error of the mean, or this little equation right here. So our standard error is equal to our standard deviation divided by our square root of our sample size. So let's break that down in the context of our study. So first, we need to find the square root of our sample size. But what is our sample size, or this n right here? We use sample size as the number of measurements for that category only. So sometimes your categories have different measurements or different samples, but this one is easier because it has the same number for both. So our sample size for hours on Instagram would be 8, or 8 students. So I'm going to take the square root of our 8 students. To do that, I click on that cell and start with our equal sign. Then I use the Excel version of square root, which is SQRT, and I'll get this that pops up. And then we're just taking the square root of 8. So I can type 8 and press enter to get our square root. Now, since this is the same exact number, I could just retype this, but I'm going to show you the function one more time. So equals the Excel version of square root, SQRT, type my sample size, or my n, which happens to be 8 again, and click enter. Next thing I need to do is calculate our standard deviation. This is also something that Excel does for us, which makes it very simple. So I'm going to again start with my equal sign. Then I'm going to type STDEV for my standard deviation. And it gives us lots of options. So we have this STDEV.P, STDEV.S, STDEVA. There's all these options. So we're just going to click the very first option here. But you can just use STDEV parenthesis. And then now I'm going to use the exact same numbers that I did for average. So I'm going to highlight just the 8 students, these 8 numbers for what I'm taking the standard deviation of. Close out my parenthesis and hit enter. And so now I have my standard deviation for the 8 students' hours on Instagram. I'm going to do that for hours on Facebook. So I start with my equal sign. I type STDEV. I'm just going to select this first option, highlight all 8 numbers, but only these 8 numbers. Close out my parenthesis and hit enter. And now I have both my standard deviations. But I'm not done yet. I need to calculate standard error. So I have one more step. So to calculate my standard error, I need to use this equation, which is the standard deviation divided by the square root of my sample size. So I'm going to start with my equal sign. I need my standard deviation first. So I'm just going to click on that cell. You can see it says B13, indicating the cell that I'm in. Do a slash or divide sign, and then click on my square root of my sample size, which happens to be right above it, that B12. I'm just going to hit enter, and I get my standard error for hours on Instagram. I'm going to do that again. So I type with my equal sign, click on my standard deviation, type a backslash, and click on the square root of my sample size. So now I have my 2 standard errors. So I'm going to add both of these numbers to my analysis table over here. So I first start out with my standard deviation for hours on Instagram, which is 0.46. We're just going to round that off to 2 decimal points. And then my standard deviation for hours on Instagram is 0.36, again, rounding off to those 2 decimal points. So now I have all my necessary values, but I still need to add my standard error to my graph. Everything else is complete, but I just need to add these error bars. So I'm going to click on my graph, tab over to chart design, my familiar tab for working with my graph, select that add chart element, and tab down to error bars. Now it's really tempting to just click on standard error, but this actually gives you a standardized standard error and doesn't give you your custom error that you actually calculated from the real values. So we need to go to more error bar options in order to add our custom values. To do this, I'm just going to go over to this box that popped up when I selected format error bars, click on custom, and then specify the value. So now I got this box that pops up. My positive error bar value and my negative error bar value are the exact same. These are my 2 values for positive and negative. So I'm going to delete what's in that positive box and then highlight both of my standard errors. It's really important to highlight both. And I'm going to do the same thing for my negative. Delete whatever is in that box and highlight both of my error bars again. I'm going to click OK. And then now I get these nice custom error bars on my graph. And that's the last step. I have finished my bar graph. I have my standard error bars, column headers, a descriptive title, and my y-axis label with units. So that is how you create a bar graph completely using Excel.